The heat was a physical thing in the town of Prospect's Claim, a weight that settled in the lungs and pressed down on the shoulders. It baked the dust of the single street into a fine, choking powder that rose in ghostly plumes with every passing horse and fell back to coat clapboard storefronts in a uniform shade of weary brown. The sky was a vast bleached sheet of blue, empty of clouds and offering no promise of relief. It was a sky that had forgotten how to rain. The sun beat down on the raw lumber of the assayer's office, the saloon, the mercantile, and the squat stone jail, rendering them all into stark shapes of light and shadow, as if the town itself were nothing more than a harsh sketch on a barren canvas. In the centre of this desolation, beside the dusty stagecoach, a woman stood alone. She was a porcelain figure left out in a kiln, fine and delicate, and in danger of cracking under the relentless glare. Her dress was of a deep blue silk, the kind of fabric that belonged in a lantern-lit hall in a city far from this high desert gulch, but its hem was frayed and stained with the grime of a long journey. Her feet, tucked into thin, embroidered slippers, wholly unsuited for the splintered boardwalk, were still. She held her hands, clasped before her, a small island of stillness in the swirl of departing passengers and shouting freight men. Her face was a mask of placid control, but her dark eyes held the vast, empty terror of a person standing at the edge of a cliff. A man named Corcoran stood before her, his face a florid knot of indignation. He owned the largest claim in the territory, the saloon, and the loyalty of the sheriff. He was a man accustomed to his will being done, his contracts being honoured. He gestured at the woman with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his voice loud enough for the gathering onlookers to hear every word. "The contract is void," he declared, his voice slick with self-righteous anger. "It stipulated a healthy woman, fit for work and for a wife. This is a ghost, a frail thing who coughed her way across the entire prairie. I paid for a workhorse, not a porcelain doll that looks ready to shatter." A murmur went through the small crowd. They were miners, prospectors, merchants and their wives, people whose lives were etched with hardship. They looked at the woman not with compassion, but with a kind of weary judgment. Weakness was a liability here, a sickness that could spread. They saw her fine dress not as a sign of a better past, but as proof of her uselessness in the present. The woman, whose name was May, said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on Corcoran's polished boots. She had been sold by her uncle to pay a gambling debt, promised a life as the wife of a wealthy man in a new land. The reality was this public humiliation, this casting off like a faulty piece of equipment. The journey had been hard, the prairie dust inflaming her lungs, but she was not broken. Yet in this moment she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was as soft as the bread in the mercantile, stepped forward. He hitched at his gun belt, an act meant to convey authority that only highlighted his discomfort. "Mr. Corcoran is right, ma'am. The arrangement is ended. You can't just stand here. You'll have to move on." Move on to where? The question hung in the shimmering air, unspoken, but absolute. There was nowhere to go. The next stage would not come for a week, and she had no money for a ticket. She had nothing but the clothes she wore and a small, tarnished silver locket hanging from a chain around her neck. From the deep shadow of the livery stable across the street, Tyne watched. He had come to town for salt, flour, and blasting powder, his monthly journey from the isolation of his claim in the stony canyons to the north. He was a man carved from the same hard rock as his surroundings, his face weathered by sun and wind into a mask of stoic neutrality. His eyes, the colour of a winter sky, missed nothing. He had seen Corcoran's swagger, heard his cruel pronouncement, and felt a familiar, cold anger settle in his gut. It was the anger of a man who despised waste and casual cruelty. He saw the way the woman stood, her dignity a fragile shield against the town's collective stare, and something in her stillness reminded him of a different kind of silence, the silence of the two graves on the hill behind his cabin. He had no use for town business, and less for the people in it. They were noisy, grasping, and dishonest. He preferred the company of wind and stone, but he could not turn his back on this. It was an offense against the simple, brutal order of things. You did not bring a person halfway across the world only to discard them in the dust like a broken tool. Tyne pushed himself away from the post he leaned against. His movements were economical, deliberate. He did not hurry. He walked across the street, his heavy work boots leaving deep prints in the powder-fine dirt. The crowd parted for him, their murmurs quieting. They knew Thane. He was the man from Stone Creek Canyon, the widower who had buried his family and then himself in the wilderness. He spoke little and bothered no one, a ghost of a man who came and went with the seasons. He stopped not in front of Corcoran or the sheriff, but directly before May. He was tall, and his shadow fell over her, a small respite from the punishing sun. He looked down at her, his gaze direct and unpitying. He saw the fine bones of her face, the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, and the unyielding pride in her eyes. He did not offer comfort or kindness. He offered a solution, as one might offer a rope to a man at the bottom of a well. "I need a cook," he said. The words were rough, scraped raw by disuse. The statement was so unexpected it silenced the street completely. Corcoran sputtered, his face purpling. "Now see here, Thane, this is none of your affair. This woman is—" Thane did not turn his head. His eyes remained on May. He ignored Corcoran as if he were a buzzing fly. He saw a flicker of confusion in her dark eyes, then a searching, intelligent assessment. She was looking past his weathered face, past the beard and the sun-squinted eyes, trying to gauge the nature of the man beneath. She was looking for the hook, the hidden price. He had none to offer. He had a cabin that had grown too quiet, meals that were functional but tasteless, and a deep-seated loneliness he refused to name. His offer was what it was, a problem and a solution. His problem was a silent, empty house. Hers was a dusty street and a town full of vultures. She held his gaze for a long moment. In the stark quiet she saw no malice in his eyes, no avarice, only a kind of weary resolve. He was not rescuing her. He was making a transaction, work for shelter. It was an offer she could accept without sacrificing the last remnants of her dignity. She gave a single small nod. It was barely a movement, but it was a definitive answer. Thane grunted in acknowledgement. He turned, his gaze sweeping over Corcoran's furious face and the sheriff's bewildered one. He gave them no further thought. He walked to his wagon, a sturdy buckboard laden with supplies, and began to untie the reins from the hitching post. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. May picked up the small, bundled cloth that held her few possessions. She walked past Corcoran without a glance, her back straight, her head held high. She reached the wagon and, with a grace that seemed out of place in the gritty town, placed her bundle in the back and climbed onto the hard wooden seat beside the silent man who had just bought her a future. Tyne flicked the reins. The mules leaned into their harnesses, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting a new path through the dust. They rode out of Prospect's claim under the weight of 100 staring eyes, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them. The road led north into the jagged, sun-blasted hills toward a place of even deeper solitude. The journey was made in silence. The groan of the wagon wheels and the clop of the mules' hooves were the only sounds between them. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, the heat of the flatlands giving way to a thin, sharp mountain breeze. Tyne kept his eyes on the trail, his hands firm on the reins. He could feel her presence beside him, a compact knot of stillness. He wondered what she was thinking, what she made of this harsh, empty land so different from her own. He wondered if she was afraid. He did not ask. They arrived at his homestead as the last light bled from the sky. It was not a ranch or a farm, but simply a place to exist. A small, solid cabin built of thick pine logs sat nestled in a canyon carved by a creek that ran swift and cold. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a habit he maintained even in summer. Behind the cabin stood a small barn, and beyond that, on a gentle rise overlooking the canyon, were two simple wooden crosses. He pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down. "This is it," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He gestured vaguely at the cabin. He unhitched the mules and led them to the barn, leaving her to take in her new surroundings. When he returned, she was still sitting on the wagon seat, her hands in her lap, looking at the two graves on the hill. Her expression was unreadable. He lit a lantern and led her inside. The cabin was one large room, bisected by a massive stone fireplace. On one side was his cot, a small table with a single chair, and shelves holding a few worn books. On the other was a cooking hearth, a dry sink, and a long plank table with two benches. It was meticulously clean but Spartan, the home of a man who had stripped his life down to its barest essentials. It was a shelter, not a home. It lacked the touch of a woman, the small comforts that had once been there. He saw it suddenly through her eyes, the bleakness, the profound and aching emptiness. "The loft is yours," he said, pointing to a ladder leading to the space above. "There's a mattress, blankets." He showed her the well outside, the woodpile, the pantry stocked with flour, beans, and salted meat. He laid out the terms of their arrangement with blunt practicality. "You cook, you clean, you'll have a roof and food. If you want to leave, I'll take you back to town when the supply wagon comes through next month." She nodded, her eyes taking in every detail of the room. She looked at the worn broom in the corner, the cast iron pots hanging by the hearth, the neatly stacked firewood. He saw not fear, but a quiet assessment, the look of a craftsman sizing up her tools and workspace. The next morning, Tyne rose before dawn, as was his custom. He expected to find her still asleep, perhaps overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. Instead, he found the main room transformed. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, chasing the morning chill from the air. The floor had been swept clean, the pots and pans scrubbed and hung in a more logical order. A pot of coffee was brewing, its rich aroma filling the cabin, a scent he had not smelled in years. May was at the table, kneading dough with an efficient, practiced rhythm. She wore a simple apron she had fashioned from a spare flour sack. She acknowledged him with a slight inclination of her head and gestured to the coffee pot. He poured himself a mug. It was strong and black, just as he liked it. He watched her for a moment, the way her small hands worked the dough, her movements precise and certain. She was not idle. She was working, establishing her territory, proving her worth. It was her answer to his offer, spoken not in words, but in labor. A new routine settled over them as easily as the mountain quiet. He would leave at sunrise to work his small gold claim further up the canyon, a back-breaking labor that yielded just enough to sustain his solitary existence. He would return at dusk, weary and covered in grime, to find the cabin warm, a hot meal waiting on the table, and a sense of order restored to his world. They rarely spoke. The gulf of language and culture was too wide, and neither was inclined to try and cross it with pleasantries. Their communication became a series of quiet, observant gestures. He noticed her thin slippers were falling apart, worn through by the rocky ground. On his next trip to town, he bought a pair of sturdy leather boots and left them by the door for her. He found them the next morning, neatly oiled and broken in, sitting beside his own. She saw that a button was missing from his winter coat. A day later, she took the coat from its peg, and by evening it was repaired, the stitching small and perfect, a new button carved from a piece of deer antler, secured in place. He learned things about her in the silence. He learned she had a gentle touch with the half-wild herbs that grew along the creek, using them to flavor the bland staples of his diet. He learned she hummed sometimes when she worked, a low melodic sound, like the buzzing of bees in summer. He learned she would often stand at the cabin door in the evening and look up at the hill where his wife and daughter were buried, her expression one of solemn understanding. She, in turn, learned him. She learned the specific weariness in his shoulders that meant he had hit a stubborn vein of quartz. She learned he preferred stew to baked beans, that he read the same book of poetry over and over, and that he sometimes paused in his work to stare at the distant peaks with a look of profound, bottomless grief. She was bringing his home back to life, and in doing so she was beginning to see the ghost of the man who had lived there before grief had hollowed him out. One afternoon, he returned early to find her sitting by the creek, a small brush in her hand. She was painting on a smooth, flat stone, using pigments she had made from berries, charcoal, and colored clay. She was rendering a picture of the canyon, the jagged peaks, the pine trees, the soaring hawk overhead. It was not just a picture. It was the place itself, captured with a skill and sensitivity that stunned him. He had lived there for 10 years and had only ever seen the rock and the dirt. She saw the beauty. He backed away without a sound, feeling as if he had intruded on something private and sacred. He had offered her shelter, and she was offering him a new way to see the world he inhabited. The transaction was no longer simple. The first snows came early that year, dusting the high peaks in late autumn before descending into the canyon. Tain was prepared. The woodpile was high, the pantry full, but the storm that came in the night was no ordinary snow. It was a blizzard, a howling white fury that descended without warning, burying the canyon in a deep, silent blanket. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the shutters and driving snow through the smallest cracks in the cabin walls. For 2 days they were prisoners in the small cabin. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a swirling vortex of white. The cold was a living entity, seeping through the logs, and they huddled close to the fire, the only source of warmth and light. The enforced proximity was a new test of their silent arrangement. The small space seemed to shrink around them, the silence between them growing heavier. On the 3rd day, the wind died down, but the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy. The wood by the hearth was running low. Tain knew he had to replenish it from the main pile outside, now buried under a formidable drift. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat and boots, took up his axe, and stepped out into the blinding white. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole his breath. He waded through the waist-deep snow to the woodpile. The axe felt clumsy in his numb hands. As he brought it down on a thick frozen log, the blade glanced off the icy surface. He tried to check the swing, but his footing was unsure in the deep powder. The axe head skipped and bit deep into his own leg, just below the knee. A hot, searing pain shot up his thigh. He looked down and saw the dark blood blossoming against the pristine snow. He gritted his teeth against a wave of dizziness, pulled the axe free, and stumbled back toward the cabin, leaving a crimson trail behind him. He collapsed through the door, the axe clattering to the floor. May was there in an instant, her eyes wide with alarm. She saw the blood, the gash in his trousers, and her face went pale, but her hands were steady. She helped him to the cot, her small frame surprisingly strong, and eased him down. Without a word, she went to work. She stoked the fire until it roared, put a kettle on to boil, and gathered clean rags. When she cut away the leg of his trousers, the wound was revealed to be worse than he thought. It was a deep, ragged cut, already welling with dark blood. He watched her as if from a great distance. Her movements were swift and efficient. There was no panic in her, only a focused, grim determination. She washed the wound with hot water and soap. Then she did something that surprised him. She went to her small bundle of possessions and took out a little silk pouch. From it, she produced a packet of dried leaves and powders. She mixed them with a little water to form a poultice and applied it to the gash. The sting was sharp, but it was a clean, medicinal pain. Finally, she took her own beautiful blue silk dress from a peg. With a pair of scissors, she began to cut it into long, clean strips for bandages. "No," he rasped, trying to sit up. "Not your dress." It was one of the few fine things she had. She pushed him gently back down. "It is only cloth," she said, her English careful and precise. "A leg is more important." She wrapped the wound tightly, her touch firm and sure. For the next few days, the world shrank to the confines of the cot and the flickering firelight. A fever took hold of Tyne, plunging him into a disorienting world of shivering chills and sweating heat. He drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of May's constant presence. She was always there, bathing his face with cool water, forcing broth and bitter herbal teas between his lips, changing the dressing on his leg. In his delirium, he spoke of things long buried. He called out for Sarah, for Lily. He mumbled about a small hand growing cold in his, about the scent of pine shavings for a small coffin. He relived the winter that had taken his family, the helplessness of watching his wife and daughter succumb to the lung fever, their breath growing shallower until it ceased altogether. Through it all, May sat with him. She listened to the fevered confessions, piecing together the fragments of his tragedy. She did not intrude on his grief, but she bore witness to it, her quiet presence a steady anchor in his storm of memory. She recognized the shape of his loss, for it mirrored her own. When the fever finally broke, Tyne woke to a world that was quiet and still. The storm had passed. Sunlight, dazzlingly bright against the new snow, streamed through the window. May was asleep in the chair by his cot, her head resting on her arms, her face etched with exhaustion. The fire had been banked and the cabin was warm. His leg throbbed with a dull, healing ache, but the burning fire of infection was gone. He lay there for a long time, watching her sleep. She had saved his life. She had sacrificed her dress, her sleep, and her meager store of medicines from her homeland to do it. He looked at her small, determined face and felt a profound shift within him. The walls he had built around his heart, stone by careful stone, had been breached. Later, when she was awake, they sat in the quiet of the snow-muffled afternoon. He was propped up on his cot, his leg bandaged and resting on a pillow. She was mending one of his shirts by the fire. "Sarah was my wife," he said, his voice still rough. "Lily was my daughter. She was 6. He gestured with his chin toward the window, toward the hill. "That winter, the fever was quick. There was nothing I could do." He fell silent, the admission costing him more than he had imagined. May stopped her sewing. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful empathy that was more comforting than any words of pity could have been. She reached for the silver locket around her neck. She opened it and held it out to him. Inside was a tiny, exquisitely painted miniature of a young man with gentle eyes and a scholar's cap. "My husband," she whispered. "His name was Way. He taught poetry at the university. He was kind. There was trouble. Soldiers. He was in the wrong place. They said he was a dissident." Her voice was a thread of sound, fragile but unbroken. "My uncle sold me to Mr. Corcoran to pay for his passage out of the city, to pay for his own safety after what happened." She closed the locket with a soft click. "I have nothing left of my life but this locket." In that moment, they were no longer a master and a servant, a provider and a dependent. They were two survivors, two people who had lost everything, adrift in a harsh and unforgiving world. The silence that fell between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding of loss. Tane looked at her, at this small, resilient woman who had faced down her own tragedy with quiet dignity, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would not let any more harm come to her. He had failed to protect his family once. He would not fail again. The thaw came a week later, and with it the world returned. The snow melted under a resurgent sun, and the creek swelled to a rushing torrent. Thine's leg healed slowly but cleanly. He was still unable to work his claim, but he could move about the cabin. The rhythm of their life returned, but it was different now, underpinned by the new intimacy of their shared confessions. It was on a clear, cold afternoon that they saw the riders, 3 of them, picking their way up the muddy canyon trail. Thane recognized them immediately: Corcoran, Sheriff Brody, and one of Corcoran's hired thugs. A cold knot formed in Tyne's stomach. Trouble had found them. He took his rifle from the pegs above the door and stood in the entryway, his bad leg braced against the frame. May came to stand just behind him in the shadows of the room, her hands clasped tightly. Corcoran reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, a smug, proprietary look on his face. His eyes swept over the tidy yard, the smoke rising from the chimney, and landed on Tane. "Well, Tane, heard you had an accident. Looks like you've been well cared for." His gaze slid past Tyne to May, a greedy, appraising look that made Tyne's hand tighten on the rifle stock. "State your business, Corcoran," Tyne said, his voice flat. "My business?" Corcoran gave a theatrical laugh. "My business is with my property. This woman broke her contract, fled her obligations. The cost of her passage from Shanghai was considerable. She owes me that debt." "She owes you nothing," Thane said. "You voided the contract yourself, in the middle of the street for all to hear." Corcoran smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "A verbal disagreement, easily rectified. I have the paperwork, all quite legal. It states that if she fails to fulfill her duties, the debt for her passage becomes due immediately. A sum of $500. He paused for effect. "But I know you don't have that kind of money, Tyne. Your little claim barely keeps you in beans and bacon. However, I am a reasonable man." He produced a folded document from his coat. "I've filed a lien against your claim for an old prospecting debt you owed me. Also quite legal. So you have a choice. You can turn over the woman to settle her debt, and I'll forget about yours. Or the sheriff here will serve this eviction notice, and I'll take the woman and your claim." Sheriff Brody had the grace to look ashamed. He wouldn't meet Tyne's eyes, focusing instead on his saddle horn. He was a puppet, and Corcoran was pulling the strings. Tyne looked from Corcoran's gloating face to the sheriff's weak one. It was a perfectly laid trap. Corcoran had used the law, twisted it into a weapon to get what he wanted. He didn't just want May back. He wanted to punish Tyne for his defiance, to crush him as an example. He could feel May's presence behind him, her quiet, frightened breathing. He thought of her painting by the creek, of her hand tending his wound, of the locket with the scholar's face inside. He thought of the 2 graves on the hill. He had built this place as a tomb for his memories, a place to slowly fade away. But she had brought life back into it. She had made it a home again. He looked directly at Corcoran, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. His decision was not a choice, but an inevitability. It was the only thing he could do. "She stays," he said, the words low and final. "Get off my land." Corcoran's smile vanished. "You're a fool, Tyne. I'll be back with the federal marshal. You'll lose everything." He wheeled his horse around, gesturing for the others to follow. "You have 1 week." They rode away, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Tyne lowered the rifle, his knuckles white. He turned and looked at May. Her face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. She had understood enough of the exchange to know the threat. "He will take this place," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "because of me." "He'll try," Tyne replied, his voice grim. He limped over to the table and sat down heavily. For the first time since his family died, he was not just defending a piece of land. He was defending a life. Their life. And he had no idea how he was going to win. The week passed with the slow, agonizing pace of a coming execution. Tyne spent his days cleaning his rifle, checking his limited supply of ammunition, and reinforcing the cabin door. He was preparing for a fight he knew he could not win. Corcoran had the law on his side, however twisted, and he had the men to enforce it. A shootout would only end with Tyne dead or in jail, and May in Corcoran's possession. May worked alongside him, her fear hidden behind a mask of calm efficiency. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. But there was a new tension in her movements, a fragility in her quietness. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the silence between them thick with unspoken possibilities and looming dread. He found himself watching her, memorizing the line of her jaw, the grace of her hands, the deep, sad wisdom in her eyes. He was a man who had been hollow for years, and he had not realized how much she had come to fill that emptiness until he was faced with losing her. On the 7th day, they came. Corcoran rode at the head of a small posse. Sheriff Brodie, the hired thug from before, and a stern-faced man with a federal marshal's badge pinned to his vest. They reined in their horses before the cabin, an intimidating line of legal authority and brute force. Tyne stepped out onto the porch. He was not holding a rifle this time. His hands were empty. He had spent the night before staring into the fire, searching for a way out, a path that did not end in bloodshed. He had found none until a desperate, impossible idea had taken root. It was a lie, a monumental gamble, but it was the only card he had left to play. "It's over, Tyne," Corcoran called out, his voice triumphant. He held up a legal document. "This is a warrant of seizure, signed by Judge Michelson himself. The claim, the cabin, everything on it is now legally mine to satisfy your debts. The marshal is here to enforce it. Hand over the woman, and we'll let you walk away with your horse." The marshal, a grim man named Peters, spoke up. "The warrant is legal, son. Don't make this difficult." Tyne stood his ground. He let the silence stretch, his gaze moving from the marshal to the sheriff, and finally to Corcoran. He took a slow breath. The door behind him opened, and May stepped out to stand beside him. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, a small gesture of solidarity that sent a jolt of strength through him. "You are mistaken, Marshal," Tyne said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. It was steady, calm, and utterly convincing. "The warrant is invalid. You have no jurisdiction here. Corcoran laughed out loud. Invalid? On what grounds? This is your land, your debt. Thane looked directly at the federal marshal, ignoring Corcoran completely. This land does not belong to me alone. The law in this territory is clear. A man's debts cannot be used to seize the home and property of his family. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he delivered the final, decisive blow. This woman, May, is my wife. This is our home. You have no claim here. The lie, bold and absolute, hung in the canyon air. A stunned silence fell over the posse. Corcoran's jaw dropped, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Sheriff Brody's eyes widened. Even the stoic marshal seemed taken aback. Your wife? Corcoran sputtered, finding his voice. That's a lie. There's no record, no preacher. Common law, Thane stated simply. We've been living here as man and wife for months. Ask anyone in town. They saw us leave together. They see us buy supplies together. In the eyes of the law and God, she is my wife. The marshal looked from Tyne's unblinking face to May's. He was a man of the law, and this development changed the entire equation. A homesteader's family had protections that a single debtor did not. Forcing a wife from her home was a messy, ugly business, and this quiet, determined man in front of him did not look like someone who would be moved easily. Before the marshal could decide, May stepped forward slightly. She looked not at Corcoran but at the marshal, her expression one of quiet dignity and gentle reproach. Sir, she said, her formal English cutting through the tension. My husband and I wish only to be left in peace. We were married according to the customs of my own people, a bond witnessed by the spirits of our ancestors and by the spirits of his family on that hill. She gestured toward the two graves. Our union is sacred. This man, she said, her gaze finally falling on Corcoran with cold disdain, seeks to dishonor that bond out of greed and spite. Her words, spoken with such eloquence and conviction, sealed the matter. The lie became a truth, sanctified by her appeal to tradition and faith. It was a masterful performance, an act of courage that left Tyne breathless. The marshal made his decision. He was here to enforce a financial warrant, not to adjudicate a marriage or throw a family out of their home. He turned his gaze to Corcoran. The warrant is for the property of Tyne, a single debtor. If he is a married man, this is a domestic matter. The warrant, as written, is unenforceable. This is an outrage, Corcoran roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He reached for the pistol at his hip, but the marshal was faster. His hand shot out and clamped down on Corcoran's wrist. You will not draw a weapon in my presence, Mr. Corcoran. The legal matter is concluded. I advise you to leave. Defeated, humiliated, and legally neutered, Corcoran could do nothing. He shot Thane a look of pure hatred. This isn't over, he snarled. But the threat was hollow. His power, built on the perception of legal invincibility, had been publicly broken. He yanked his horse's head around and galloped recklessly down the canyon, his thug and a reluctant sheriff trailing behind him. The marshal lingered for a moment. He gave Thane a long, searching look, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. He tipped his hat slightly toward May. Ma'am. Then he too turned and rode away, leaving Tyne and May standing together in the sudden, profound silence of the canyon. They stood there for a long time after the riders had gone, the echo of hoofbeats fading into the vast quiet of the mountains. The lie they had told, a desperate fabrication spun from thin air, still seemed to shimmer between them. It had been a weapon, a shield, and now it was something else entirely. A question. May slowly removed her hand from his arm. Tyne felt its absence like a sudden chill. He turned to look at her. really look at her. He saw the courage it had taken for her to step forward, to speak, to claim a place for herself, not as a victim, but as a wife, a defender of her own home. Without a word, they went back inside the cabin. The air was thick with unspoken things. The routine of their day took over, a familiar rhythm to cling to in the wake of the storm. He added wood to the fire. She began to prepare the evening meal, but everything had changed. The space between them was no longer a gulf of silence, but a bridge built of shared danger and a shared, audacious lie. That evening they sat at the table, the stew she had made warming them from the inside out. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. The cabin felt more secure than ever before, a fortress they had successfully defended. Finally, Tyne broke the silence. His voice was low, careful. "What I said to the marshal." He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "It was the only thing I could think of." May met his gaze across the table. Her expression was calm, her dark eyes luminous in the firelight. "What you said," she replied softly, "saved us." He nodded, the words catching in his throat. He had been alone for so long, a man living alongside his own grief. He had forgotten what it felt like to be part of an us. He had forgotten the strength that could be found not in solitude but in standing with someone. After the meal, they sat in their usual chairs by the fire. The tension of the past week had finally dissipated, replaced by a deep, quiet sense of peace. He watched the flames, but his awareness was entirely focused on the woman sitting a few feet away. He thought of his life before she arrived, a grey, monotonous cycle of work, eat, and sleep. A waiting for the end. She had brought colour, flavour, and warmth back into his world. She had brought life. He cleared his throat. "May," he said, the sound of her name on his lips, feeling both strange and right. "What I said to the marshal, it does not have to be a lie." She turned her head to look at him, her expression unreadable. He saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, of fear, perhaps, but also a glimmer of hope. He stood up and walked the few steps to her chair. He knelt on one knee before her, an awkward, unpracticed gesture for a man more comfortable with an axe than with tenderness. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were small and cool in his calloused palm. It was the first time they had touched with deliberate, gentle intent. "I have nothing to offer you," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he could not name. "This is a hard place. My heart is a broken thing. But this home, this life, it is better with you in it. It is whole with you in it." He looked into her eyes, laying his soul bare. "I would be honored if you would be my wife. For truth." Tears welled in her eyes, shining like liquid starlight. She did not pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it and curled her fingers around his, her grip surprisingly firm. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. Slowly, she reached up with her other hand and unclasped the silver locket from her neck. She held it in her palm for a moment, her thumb stroking the tarnished surface. Then, with a quiet finality, she opened it one last time, gazing at the tiny portrait of the husband she had lost, the life that had been stolen from her. She looked at it, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a gentle, sad farewell. She closed it, and leaning forward, placed the locket on the rough stone of the mantelpiece. It sat there, a relic of a past she was finally letting go, no longer an anchor to what was lost, but a marker of a journey that had led her here. She looked back at Tyne, a small, tremulous smile touching her lips for the first time. She gave a single, deliberate nod. It was the same gesture she had used at the stagecoach, the simple acceptance that had started everything. But this time, it was not an answer born of desperation. It was an answer born of hope, of... He rose and gently pulled her to her feet. They stood before the fire, hand in hand, the silence between them no longer a void, but a shared space of comfort and understanding. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the stars emerged in the cold, clear sky, scattered like diamonds on black velvet. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but inside the small log cabin, two solitary people had found a home in each other. They had built a fortress not of stone and wood, but of shared courage and a love as quiet and steadfast as the mountains themselves.